Okay, this is from the Hepworth text on the helping process, and chapter 3 gives us an overview of the helping process, and it is indeed just an overview. Most of the textbook and what we're going to be working throughout the semester when we read Hepworth involves much more detailed material in terms of the helping process and how to go about working with clients on a direct basis. Nonetheless, this chapter really doesn't fit in with the other readings assigned for the week, and so I just thought I'd do a brief talk about this particular chapter and kind of walk you through some of the just the basic ideas of what's involved in the helping process as far as these authors are concerned. There are common elements among diverse theorists and social workers when it comes to working with clients. This Social workers work with individuals, families, couples, groups, and other larger systems, and draw on all sorts of different kinds of theories about human behavior. We use different models of practice. We implement different types of interventions, very diverse interventions, even with the same particular types of problems and particular types of clients. And yet, at the same time, we also serve widely different clients so that sometimes studies that may apply to particular populations don't apply to others. An example of this, for instance, in the my work at OCS for years and years and years, we used a tool called the risk assessment tool. We sadly refer to as the RAT, and there are variations on this risk assessment tool used now, and I wouldn't even begin to tell you that I remember the name of the tool that we were using when I left the agency a few years ago. It's probably not being used anymore anyway, as we continue to develop better ways of approaching things. But in any event, this RAT was sort of an institution in the agency, and it was one of the things that we used after we had met with clients to determine future risk of abuse and neglect, and it helped us to determine whether or not to keep cases open or not. Well, the issue was the RAT was developed by and was statistically valid and reliable according to the studies that have been done on it. Was developed by a professional organization, I believe, out of Minnesota, but was also used as a sample of individuals from the lower 48. And so here we are using this tool and determining risk of future abuse or neglect with clients in rural Alaska or urban Alaska, and our population has many different factors that impact them as compared to the kinds of factors that impact clients in other states. And so, in any event, a study was implemented, while I was working there, making use of the RAT and trying to develop a standardized outcome, standardized questions and things like this that utilized Alaska clients in order to do that. And I believe about the time that we were ready to conclude that, as I recall, that's when we dropped the use of that. That we had a change of administration, as often happens, and we stopped using that particular tool, even though it was almost validated for Alaskan clients. But in any event, this just goes to show that even these tools that are used and considered to be useful elsewhere might not be useful in Alaska and vice versa. And that's true for not just Alaska, but many different kinds of populations. But anyway, all these differences in who we work with and how we go about working with them, we share a common goal, and that is that we all want to assist clients in, well, from at least from an individual treatment perspective, a direct practice perspective. We want to assist them in coping more effectively with problems of living and improving the quality of their lives. Now, our mission is larger than that and also involves, advocacy for them on a much larger level, at an environmental level as well. But in terms of direct practice, this is a goal that we can all agree upon, I think. But even as we approach our work, our clients' reaction to forces both within themselves and outside of themselves also plays a very big part in their willingness, their motivation, their capacity to work with us, and their reaction to the prospects of contact with the social worker. The helping process is divided into three phases in Hepworth's world, and that is the phase one is the exploration, engagement, assessment, and planning phase. Phase two is implementation and goal attainment, and we'll be there in a minute. And phase three is evaluation and termination, or the terminal phase, I believe it's referred to here. So in phase one, during phase one, what we're looking at is exploring the client's problems by eliciting data about the person, the particular nature of the problem, the environmental factors surrounding the client, and in which the problem behaviors may exist, and also, including the forces that are involved in the referral. Is this a child brought by parents? Is a spouse threatening to leave if this individual doesn't get treatment, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, there's a number of different things we need to explore as we begin to try to identify what the client's problem is, and begin to evaluate, begin to assess how to intervene. In the process of this, we are in this early phase establishing rapport with the client and taking what steps we can partly through establishing rapport, as well as other things to enhance the motivation of the client. This may involve eliciting not only the client may be brought to us with a particular reason for referral, but the client may or may not agree, as you know, with what well, even with being there, but if they are going to be there, what it is that they wish to achieve from this interaction. And so one of the things you want to do in the early phase is also elicit from the client what their perspective is on the problem, and what kinds of things they may wish to work on, or how they may wish to approach this particular issue. So you're going to formulate a multi-dimensional assessment of the problems at this phase, identify the systems that play a significant role in these difficulties, identify the resources that are out there that might be tapped, or those that have to be developed in order to assist the client move forward. And you begin to negotiate goals and formulating a contract with the client. You do this in a mutual way, so that it isn't something that's being imposed on the client, but is one that engages the client. The more active the client is in establishing goals and those kinds of things, the more likely it is the client's going to participate willingly in this. And this is true and can be true for involuntary clients as well. Those ones who are coming in as a resistor, I believe, as I think it was one of our authors mentioned. So and then also if there are particular areas in the client's problems that we're not capable of dealing with, either because of our own level of expertise or the limitations of what our agency's mission is or goal is, we may make referrals to other competent providers in the community to assist with other particular areas. That's phase one. Phase two involves translating the plans that are formulated jointly by the social worker and the clients into actions. And so there's been a lot of research to indicate that the helping process is greatly enhanced when clients experience an increased sense of self-efficacy as a part of this process. And so we want to really focus upon the client being able to take action and to have an impact upon things, and to be able to recognize that. So that has something to do with I think the goals that we first set out there. We don't establish goals that are beyond the client's reach early on, but perhaps design goals or establish goals that are something that is achievable for the client, so the client can experience some early success and begin to feel like they have some self-efficacy in their lives as well. As we work towards towards goal attainment, we have to monitor the progress on a regular basis during this phase. And as they strive to accomplish the goals and other tasks that are associated with their goals, the client's progress is unlikely to be smooth and uneventful. And so we have to watch out for the barriers to that goal accomplishment and work together to solve those problems, or perhaps it's emotional reactions of other people around them. As we create change for our client, particularly this is true if we're working with one person in a larger family system, such as an adolescent brought in for treatment for behavioral problems, or even perhaps you're working with an alcoholic adult, and the alcoholism creating problems, or other substance abuse causing problems in the family system. As the client begins to change, other individuals in that system are also going to have to make adjustments. And if those individuals are not engaged in one way or another in this process, oftentimes the progress of the individual client could be sabotaged very, very quickly. And so to look at those kinds of things that occur within the client's family system or in the environment that may impede progress and maybe even discourage progress for that matter. Sometimes clients have emotional reactions to the change. Those reactions or the reactions of those around them could be pleasing, could be frightening, could be confusing, those kinds of things. And if you're working in a group environment, if you're working with clients in a group, oftentimes the processes within the group itself may covertly impede progress, and that's something that as a group leader you'll need to be aware of and cautious of as well. As our clients start to risk trying out new interpersonal behaviors in their family or group contexts, sometimes they have their own experiences, their own emotions to that change, and so the that's something that you need to be aware of and constantly get feedback from the client about. There are all sorts of tools that you can use in working with clients to identify what's going on inside of them, positive and negative, and as change occurs. And some of those techniques involve, like for instance, confrontation. And confrontation doesn't have to be with the jackhammer. In fact, shouldn't be. It should be a confrontation that will certainly bring the client's attention to their particular problem, but not scare that client away necessarily. Additive empathy is another kind of response, and more attention is given to this much later in the Hepworth book. I'm not sure why it's in such a late chapter. It would seem like it would be useful to have it earlier in the book, but we'll be touching on that later on, where you're not just responding to the things the clients are saying, but you're responding to the meaning of what they're saying and the implied kinds of things that are involved in what's going on there that sort of is underneath the surface. And the client's really got to be at a spot where they're ready to accept that from you. There has to be a good therapeutic relationship established before the client's going to be able to respond to that appropriately. But those are techniques that are very powerful in helping process. Now, as your helping relationship gets stronger during all of this, increasingly you're going to use yourself perhaps as a tool to facilitate growth and accomplishment in clients. And the use of self is something that can again be very powerful as well, but also has its limitations and has its caveats we'll be talking about as time goes on. You don't want to, while on the one hand, you want to respond as a genuine individual, and genuineness is one of those things, with honest responses and reactions to your clients, one of those things that really helps the therapeutic relationship. At the same time, too much self-revelation, for instance, is oftentimes inappropriate, and so something that as a relationship develops more and more, you use more of yourself, but with caution. So that's for later in the semester. Again, we'll talk more about that. Finally, the third phase, the termination phase, is when we really kind of look at what the client's goals were to begin with, and to assess whether or not they've been satisfactorily attained. And then we begin to turn the client's attention to later on, and how the clients will maintain change, that goal maintenance, once the client no longer has contact with you, and continue to grow after the relationship has terminated, and then terminate the helping relationship successfully. Now, oftentimes with a lot of our clients, particularly you'll see this with children and those who have had damaged childhoods. Terminating relationships is a very painful process, and it can be a positively painful process, and I think you know what I mean by that, sort of a bittersweet kind of thing. Parting is such sweet sorrow, as Shakespeare said, but in fact, the experience of our clients oftentimes is that relationships terminate in crisis, and terminate in anger, and terminate in severe loss. And so being able to end a relationship on a positive note. And it doesn't mean that you have to slam the door shut and never see the client again, but to be able to terminate this particular relationship in this particular way, in a positive way, is something that can be a whole new experience for a client, and give them an opportunity to really grow as an individual. Again, more on that as the semester goes along. Now, the interviewing process itself, there are a lot of variables that affect interviews. Um, there still are certain uh, factors that are common to all effective interviews, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. But interviews going to vary according to the purpose. Is it a crisis interview? Is it an interview in the middle of a relationship, or late in the relationship, or at the very beginning? Are you really more involved in assessing things? I mean, you've been involved in a number of interviews throughout your lives as an individual as well as a professional. The type of setting varies, the characteristic of clients, the number of participants, and all these kinds of things have an impact upon the process itself. But there are factors in the interviewing process that can impact the way the interview goes. And physical conditions aren't something that should be taken too lightly, because these kinds of things, speak to the comfort that you afford the client, and can speak a lot to what your perception of your client is as well. If you have an office, and if I have sort of a bit of an OCD kind of approach, so that everything has to be neat and clean and all that. I'm not talking about that, but your client has to, your office, or the area that you're interviewing a client, should be ordered in such a way that it shows respect for the individual you're talking to. Not, for instance, if you have a common interviewing room, which is becoming more and more the case in social service agencies, where you may work in a cubicle and do most of your work there, but when it comes time to meet with a client, you have some interview rooms. Advocate to get those rooms softened, and at least again, it depends on the setting, but in most cases, to the point where there's some artwork in the office, perhaps some things that just kind of create an air of comfort and an air of security in the office. Don't allow your agency to relegate you to interviewing your clients in a room where there's a bunch of boxes stacked in the corner and a couple file cabinets with drawers overflowing. Those kinds of things. Make sure the room is clean. That type of stuff. All that stuff's very important, and speaks to the client very, very loudly in terms of how you perceive the client. If it's your own office, you have more control over what's there, and whether you have personal items in the office. Some individuals believe it's useful to have pictures of family. Others don't. And again, depends a lot upon your setting, perhaps. Your diplomas, I believe personally, ought to be hanging on the wall in your office, or in an area where clients can see them. That isn't something to brag about. It is documentation of your education, and it provides some reassurance to your clients that you know a little bit about what you're doing. Your license, if you're licensed as a LMSW or LCSW later in your career, you're supposed to display your license, and there's a good reason for that, because it tells your clients that if you participate in any kind of malpractice, there's somebody they can go to get some help. But that display also says that the state or your professional organization, whoever it is behind you and endorses you as somebody who's competent, and it's good that your clients can see those things. Personally, I think having some professional books there is another thing that that kind of stuff. Just think about how you arrange your office or the interviewing space, and then look at other factors like ventilation, the furniture, keep the temperature of the room comfortable, be sure it's not too crowded. That's another thing. You don't want to crowd your clients, and so I've actually remember interviewing in offices where clients had to literally kind of move sideways to get between the desk and the chair, to sit down, that kind of thing. And it wasn't anything I could do anything about, but you want to try to guard against that as much as possible. Arrange so that you can interview the client without having to make physical contact with the client. Again, depending upon your role. you may, in the agency you're working in, you may want to turn your desk around so that you don't have the desk between you and your client. All those kinds of things have something to do with how the client's going to respond to you. The chair the client sits on is another thing, and a lot of people will tell you that your client's chairs should have arms on them. That's something that sometimes individuals that are experiencing some anxiety, it's very helpful to them to have something to grab a hold of, while they're talking with you, even sort of unconsciously having that support there. Now, the interview itself, there's a structure, of course, where you, as we talked about earlier, you begin with some effort to establish rapport and start where the client is. That may involve not only clarifying why the client is before you, but if that client is not a voluntary client, then what is it exactly that the client thinks ought to be attained from these contacts, if at all possible. But rapport that you establish with clients fosters a more free communication, and that's really the hallmark of effective interviews. Starting with what client's motivation is, aids you in establishing and sustaining rapport and in maintaining some form of psychological contact with the client. And in terms of ethnic minorities and immigrant clients, which you will encounter from time to time, especially if they don't have an adequate command of the English language, you want to try to get a reliable and trustworthy interpreter that understands the issue of confidentiality and can interpret effectively back and forth, so that you have an opportunity to bridge cultural and both cultural language as well as cultural value differences and those kinds of things. When the clients indicate that they're ready to discuss their problem situation, it's appropriate to begin the process of exploration. But it's important before you do that to determine what the client's expectations are of this relationship and this contact, because this varies considerably and is going to be influenced a lot by socioeconomic levels, cultural backgrounds, how sophisticated the client is, what other experience they may have had with helping professionals and those kinds of things. So, it's very useful to determine these kinds of things early on. Also, I think during the exploration process, the social worker is assessing the significance of information revealed as the client talks about his or her problems and interacts with the worker and any other people in the interview itself. So in the process of this, you're using outlines necessary for a good interview, but you should be assessing emotional and cognitive functioning while you're doing this, and also it's useful very early in relationships, again in the appropriate setting, but in most of our social work settings, to begin to explore for issues about substance abuse, family violence, sexual abuse, those kinds of things as well. There sometimes, if you have going back to this phase, sometimes if you have an outline to follow, that lists essential questions to be answered, it can be very helpful for you, especially early in your career. Now, as time goes on, you're not going to need that outline anymore. And if you may feel like you need to take notes also, and particularly, even later in your career, it may be very important for you to take specific notes of what the client says. For instance, in forensic interviews, if it's not being recorded otherwise. But remember that the client may ask you. The client is going to see you taking notes and may ask to see those notes or may ask what you're writing. And most of us believe that the client has a right to see what you're writing down. So I had a supervisor a long time ago who told me that, write my case notes, and this is true not only about the notes in session or in your meeting, but also the permanent record, don't write down anything that you wouldn't want your client to read, because the client may very well read that. And we'll get more into record keeping and things like that, I think, later on, but you want to keep that as much to observations, only recording the things that are absolutely, that should be recorded, and not putting in a lot of extraneous information or any judgments or things like that regarding the client. And so, as the process goes on, then we're going to introduce the process of goal negotiation by explaining the rationale behind establishing goals, basically. And so during this early interview process, the workers should suggest things like the length and frequency of sessions, who's going to participate in them, the means, what the if as goals are established, how we're going to go about establishing those goals together, how long your client may expect to be engaged in this treatment relationship. Also, if you're in a position where fees are a part of your relationship, as is the case in, like, for instance, outpatient mental health or private practice, and sometimes in other agencies, you also want to be sure that your fee schedule is clear to the client, and determine whether or not there's going to be issues with that. Other kinds of relevant matters as well. So anyway, at this phase, I think your skills are going to be used to help your clients accomplish their goals, and assuming that the client expresses a willingness to continue with the helping process. So use appropriate messages to conclude interviews, which is, engage the what's next is always a big thing. When will I see you again? And what about between now and then? Those kinds of things, and end the interview on a positive note, obviously. So that's it for this particular chapter. It's a very short, and I said it was an overview, and that indeed is what it is. So all of this is going to be explicated much more thoroughly as the semester goes along. But that's it for chapter 3 in the Hepworth book.